I have been a translator my whole adult life, and a translator learns early that the most dangerous sentence in any language is the one a powerful person believes he already understands. The Concordance believed it understood us completely. That belief is written into their founding charter, into the floor of their great hall, into the bones of the people who built it. It is also, as it turns out, the single largest error any governing body in the recorded galaxy has ever committed, and I had the unusual privilege of standing close enough to watch them make it word by word. My name is Iris Maddox. On the day the Concordance voted to remove humanity from existence by the quiet mechanism of exile, I was 41 years old, and I was the chief interpreter for Earth's standing delegation. I am much older now. I have spent the years since trying to render one thing into a language that has no category for it, and I have not succeeded, and I no longer believe I will. But I can tell you what happened. I was there. I heard every word in both directions, and I am one of the few left who heard them in the order they were actually spoken. The assembly of the Concordance sat on a world they called the Hearth, though nothing about it was warm. It was a neutral capital, chosen centuries before any of us were invited, a planet of pale stone, and engineered where the member species could meet without anyone enjoying a home advantage. The hall itself was vast and bright. They built it under a single dome of cultured crystal that took the day's light and spread it flat across the chamber so that no corner held a shadow and no speaker could hide a face. The Concordance prized that. They believed light was a kind of honesty, that a species which could be seen entirely could be known entirely, and they had built an entire civilization on the assumption that to catalog a thing was to finish it. That assumption had a name. They called it the Register of Forms. The register was the spine of the Concordance, older than its treaties, older than its borders. Every species the Concordance had ever encountered was entered into it and assigned a class. There were 3 classes only, and the simplicity of the thing was the whole of its authority. A species could be ascendant, meaning it had reached its full and final shape and could be admitted as a peer. It could be terminal, meaning it had reached an end state and was in decline, to be observed and mourned and eventually closed. Or it could be provisional, meaning it was unfinished, still moving, not yet what it would be, and therefore not yet anything the Concordance was obliged to treat as real. Humanity was filed provisional. We had been filed provisional since first contact, and in the 11 years I served the delegation we had never once been able to move the entry. I translated for 3 ambassadors across those years, and every one of them came to understand, sooner or later, that the provisional classification was not an insult and not a negotiating posture. It was sincere. The Concordance honestly did not consider us a finished species. They had measured us, found us changeable, and concluded that a thing still changing could not be a thing at all. The strange part, the part I did not understand the weight of until much later, is that the Concordance had measured our homeworld with great care and reached a separate verdict entirely. Earth was entered in the survey annex as a Class 14 death world, a designation reserved for worlds whose own conditions kill most things that try to hold a fixed shape on them, and the Concordance's biologists had written long, careful notes on the lethality of the place, the gravity and the predators and the temperature swings, and the sheer, relentless pressure of a planet that never let anything settle. They had the homeworld file and the species file open on the same lectern, and they never once put them together. They read the deadliness of the world as a curiosity, a hardship the species had escaped, and they read the species as unfinished, and it never occurred to them that the 2 readings were the same reading, that a thing born on a world that punishes fixedness might be built, down in the part the surveys could not reach, to never finish at all. They had both halves of the answer in the book. They filed them on different pages. The ambassador I served at the end was a man named Cole Renner. He was not a large man. He had a flat, unhurried way of moving and a voice that never rose, and the first time the drawl honor blades flanked him in a corridor he looked at them the way a man looks at weather. I want to be precise about him, because a great deal of nonsense has been said about that day since, and most of it makes him into something he was not. He did not glare. He did not bristle. He carried himself like a man who had read the last page of a book, and was patient enough to let everyone else finish reading. The drawl are the reason I need to explain the warrior caste before I explain the vote. Among the Concordance's member species, the drawl held the seat that mattered most, which was the seat that decided what the others were afraid of. They were a tall people, saurian in the broad sense, their hide a worked bronze that darkened along the crest of the skull where the older ones grew a ridge of horn. They had four-chambered eyes that read motion before they read shape, and a culture built entirely on the open display of strength. A drawl's standing was not a matter of title or wealth. It was a matter of what he had visibly survived, and what visibly feared him, and a drawl who could not point to both was not a person at all in their reckoning. They had a single concept at the center of their law, a word I rendered for our records as fixedness, though the word carried more than that. To the drawl, every creature had a true and final form, the shape it would die in, and the whole purpose of life was to reach that form early and then hold it against all comers. A thing that kept changing its shape was, to them, a coward and a liar in the same breath. It refused to commit to what it was. You can see, perhaps, why the drawl and the register found each other so comfortable. The register said species had final forms. The drawl said individuals did. Between the two of them, they had built a galaxy in which the worst thing a creature could be was unfinished, and they had looked at us, and they had decided we were the most unfinished thing they had ever logged. The war marshal of the drawl was named Savok. I translated for Savok more times than I can count, and I will tell you plainly that he was not stupid. Stupidity would be easier to live with. He was intelligent and he was thorough, and he was wrong in the particular way that only the genuinely capable can be wrong, which is to say completely and with documentation. He had read everything the Concordance held on us. He had read our genome surveys and our population models and our 100-year projections. He had concluded from all of it that we were a provisional species trending terminal, an animal that had climbed onto a high branch too fast and would shortly fall off it. And he had decided that the responsible thing, the strong thing, was to remove us from the register before our fall took anyone down with us. He moved the vote himself. I remember the morning of it with the flat clarity you get from the worst days. The dome poured its even light down on the tiers of the hall, on the slate-gray bureaucrats of the speaker's species and the four-armed scholars who kept the register, and the dozen other delegations whose names I learned and forgot across the years. Renner sat at the human station, which the Concordance had placed, as it always did, at the lowest tier, the one nearest the floor, the one reserved for provisional entries who were permitted to attend but not to vote. I sat at his shoulder with my hands folded, listening in two languages at once, which is the only way I know how to listen anymore. Renner had known the vote was coming. We all had. The Concordance does not move on a provisional entry without months of procedural notice, filed in triplicate and entered into the record, because the Concordance believes that warning is itself a kind of mercy, that a thing told in advance it will be removed cannot later claim it was wronged. We had received the notice 81 days before. I had translated it myself, at the delegation table, while Renner listened with his hands flat on the wood and said nothing, and when I had finished he had thanked me and folded the notice once and set it aside, and that was the whole of his reaction. I had served 2 ambassadors before him who would have spent those 81 days in motion, drafting appeals, calling on the few delegations that would still take a meeting, building the case that would not be heard. Renner did none of it. He read the briefs. He kept his appointments. On the morning of the vote, he ate a plain breakfast in the delegation quarters and walked to the hall at an ordinary pace. And when I asked him, because I could not help it, whether he wished to review the points one final time, he told me there were no points. He said the Concordance had already decided, months before, and that the session was not a decision but the recording of one, and that the only thing left to do was to be present for the recording and to say, when the moment came, the one thing worth entering into a record that would outlast everyone in the room. I did not know yet what that one thing would be. I learned it the same instant the chamber did. Savak rose, and the chamber gave him the silence it gave to no one else. He spoke for a long time. I will not reproduce all of it. It does not deserve the room. He laid out the case against us as a clerk lays out an inventory, calm and total. He said the human entry had been provisional for 11 years and showed no sign of resolving. He said a species that could not settle into a form was a hazard to every species that had. He said our growth curves were unstable, our internal divisions irrational, our presence in shared corridors a standing risk. He never once raised his voice. The most chilling thing about Savak was that he treated our removal as a maintenance task. He was not angry at us. You cannot be angry at a thing you have already decided is not real. And then, because the Draal never made a decision without first making a display of it, he called the honor blades onto the floor. There is a ritual the Draal perform when they intend to remove a thing they have judged terminal. They post 10 of their best warriors around it. 10, always 10, the number their oldest law assigns to a creature too dangerous to be left unwatched and too finished to be worth more. The ritual is a courtesy in the way a tombstone is a courtesy. It says, "We acknowledge you were once something, and we are strong enough to contain what you have become, and we will stand here while you end so that the galaxy may see who ended you." The 10 warriors came down onto the bright floor in full ceremonial harness, bronze hide catching the flat light, and they arranged themselves in a closed ring around the human station. Around Renner. Around me. I will not pretend my heart was steady. I had translated the meaning of that ring for our records years before, in a footnote no one was meant to ever need, and now I was sitting inside it. The nearest warrior stood close enough that I could hear the slow working of his breath and smell the dry mineral scent of his hide. They did not look at us. That was the point. To look at a thing you contain is to admit it might still act. They looked outward at the chamber, presenting the spectacle of our containment to the assembly that would now vote on whether we should be allowed to keep on existing. Renner did not move. He watched Savak finish. When the war marshal had said the last of it, when the case was closed and the speaker had called for the Concordance to record its will on the matter of the human entry, the chamber turned, almost as one, to see what the small animal at the bottom of the room would do inside its ring of blades. Renner asked through me for the floor. The speaker, who I think expected pleading and wanted to enjoy it, granted it. He stood. He was a head shorter than the warrior beside him. He looked up the long, bright tears at Savak and at the four-armed scholars who held the register open on their lectern, and he said one sentence. I rendered it into the Concordance trade tongue exactly as he gave it to me, with nothing added and nothing softened, because that was my work, and because the sentence needed no help. He said, "You have filed the larva and shelved the animal." That was all. He sat down. I have replayed the chamber's reaction more times than is healthy. There was a pause, and then a low rolling sound from the upper tiers, the Concordance equivalent of indulgent laughter, the sound a confident body makes when a creature it has already condemned says something it takes for bravado. The four-armed scholars at the register conferred and entered Renner's words into the record under the heading reserved for non-substantive remarks. Savak did not laugh. He tilted his crested head a degree, the Draal gesture for noting a thing without crediting it, and he let the ring of warriors hold while the speaker called the question. The vote was not close. Provisional entries had no defenders in that hall, because to defend a provisional was to admit it might be real, and no ascendant species wanted that precedent attached to its name. The tally came in within the hour. The Concordance voted to expunge the human entry from active standing, to revoke our corridors, to seal our access to the shared lanes, and to enter Earth into the Register's closed annex under the only category that fit a provisional being removed without being granted the dignity of a final form. They did not file us terminal. Terminal would have meant we had reached an end state, and they were not willing to grant us even an ending. They filed us lapsed, unfinished and abandoned mid-shape, a draft they had decided not to complete. The 10 warriors held the ring until the decree was sealed, and then, on a single word from Savok, they stepped back from the human station in perfect order and returned to their tier. The ritual was complete. They had contained the terminal thing while the galaxy watched it be removed. As far as the Drawl were concerned, they had just witnessed the last day humanity would matter. I gathered our records. Renner gathered nothing. He had brought nothing. We walked out of the assembly of the Concordance through a corridor of indifferent eyes, and behind us the great bright dome poured its flat, honest light down onto a floor that no human foot would touch again for 41 years. I want to be careful here about how I describe the exile itself, because the truth of it is less dramatic and far worse than the versions people tell. There was no battle. That is the first thing to understand. The Concordance did not need a battle. They simply closed the doors. Within a span of their standard months, every corridor that connected human space to the shared lanes was revoked, lane by lane, with the unhurried thoroughness of a body canceling a subscription. The relays that had carried our traffic went dark to us. The way stations that had stamped our transit logged us as lapsed and refused our codes. The Concordance did not come to our worlds. They did not have to. They had simply decided that we were no longer on the map, and the map was theirs, and so we were no longer anywhere. I was among the delegation that withdrew. We had a choice, technically. We could have stayed on the hearth as private persons, stateless, tolerated. None of us took it. We went home through the last open lane before it closed behind us, and I remember standing at a viewport as the relay went dark and thinking, with the cold clarity I have come to distrust in myself, that I had just watched a door shut on the largest population of human beings ever to live, and that not one being on the far side of that door considered it a tragedy. To the Concordance, it was housekeeping. They had a provisional entry that would not resolve, and now they did not. The decades that followed were not, on the human side, what the Concordance projected. But here is the thing I have come to understand, the thing that is the entire spine of this account, and I need to say it plainly before I tell you what we became. We did not survive the exile, we molted through it. Savok's models were not wrong about the form he had measured. He had measured us accurately. He had taken the exact dimensions of what we were in that hall on that day, a young species, fractured, loud, spread thin across borrowed lanes, and he had projected that form forward and found it could not last. He was correct. The form he measured could not have lasted. What he could not account for, what the Register had no field to record, was that the form he measured was never meant to last. It was a stage. It was the shape we held while we were still inside the shared lanes, still observed, still arranging ourselves to be legible to a body that demanded legibility. It was the larva. And the one condition under which a larva completes its change, the one thing it requires above food and warmth and time, is to be left alone in the dark where nothing is watching it. The Concordance gave us that. They gave us 41 years of being unobserved, unmeasured off the map, with our doors closed and no surveyor's eye on us, and they called it a punishment. To a species still in its larval form, it was the precise environment the change required. I lived through those years the way everyone did, which is to say I did not perceive the shape of them while they were happening. I kept my work. There were still meetings, internal ones now among ourselves, among the worlds that had been cut off together. I translated less between species and more between the parts of ourselves that the exile threw into contact, the colony tongues that had drifted, the technical dialects, the old delegations learning to speak to engineers and the engineers learning to speak to the long planners. It was quieter work and in some ways harder. I was no longer rendering us legible to the Concordance. I was rendering us legible to each other, and a people doing that, a people forced to explain itself only to itself with no outside audience to perform for, becomes something a watched people cannot. There is a session I return to, from somewhere in the middle years, that I think holds the change better than any survey could. I had been called to render between an old corridor planner, a woman who had spent her career arranging human traffic through Concordance lanes, and a young engineer who had been a child when the doors closed and had never once seen a shared lane in operation. The planner was trying to explain to the engineer why a certain class of relay had always been built to a concordance tolerance, why the margins were set where they were set, and the engineer kept stopping her politely to ask why we had ever accepted a tolerance designed by someone else. The planner had no answer. She had spent 40 years inside an assumption she had never been asked to defend, the assumption that our works should be legible to the body that graded them. And here was a young engineer who had grown up in the dark and did not carry the assumption at all, asking her, without heat, why we had ever built anything to be read by strangers. I translated the exchange word for word, and somewhere in the middle of it, I understood that I was no longer translating between two humans. I was translating between two forms. The planner was the larva, still shaped by the gaze that had made her. The engineer was the thing the dark was building, and the thing the dark was building did not recognize the gaze at all. It did not resent the concordance. It simply did not account for it. You cannot perform for an audience you have never imagined exists, and a whole generation was coming up now that had never imagined the audience. And so the whole generation built things no committee would ever have approved, because no committee had ever entered its mind. I have translated a great many hard documents in my life. I have never translated anything harder than that ordinary technical argument, because it was the first time I heard, in plain working speech, the sound of a species that had stopped explaining itself. Those same middle years were the hardest ones for survival, and I do not want the engineer's clarity to stand without the cost beside it. The relays the planner had built to concordance tolerance were the ones that failed first when the parts stopped coming, and the colonies that depended on them were the colonies I translated the manifests for. A manifest is a cold document by design, a list of names and a column of numbers, and I rendered a great many of them from the colony tongues into the working language so the long planners could read what the change was costing. I have never gotten used to the work of putting a death into a second language. The number does not change. The names do not change. But you handle each one twice, once to read it and once to write it, and after enough of them you stop being able to pretend you are only a conduit. I was not only a conduit. None of us were only what the concordance had filed us as. I watched the change without naming it. I watched us stop building for the concordance's gaze. Everything we had made in the shared lane years had carried, somewhere in its design, an awareness of being seen, a legibility, a willingness to be measured and found acceptable. That fell away. With no one grading us, we stopped explaining ourselves, and a species that stops explaining itself starts, very quickly, to do things it would never have been able to justify to a committee. We did not become warlike. That is the part the drawl could never have predicted, because to the drawl the only growth is the growth of threat. We became something stranger and, in the end, far heavier. We became patient on a scale we had never had the privacy to attempt. I am told there was, somewhere in the early years of the exile, a concordance survey, a routine sweep decades out, checking the closed annex entries against current observation. I have seen the relevant page of the register since, and I will tell you what it said because it is the most quietly damning document I have ever read. The survey reported that the human corridor had gone fully dark, no traffic on the old lanes, no detectable expansion, no signal on the bands the concordance monitored. The surveyors, finding a lapsed entry that now showed no activity at all, did the responsible thing by their own lights. They upgraded our file. They moved us at last from lapse to terminal, and then, a few years on with the corridor still dark, They did the final clerical kindness and marked the entry closed. Closed. Do you understand what that meant to them? It meant the question of humanity was settled. It meant a provisional entry had failed to resolve, gone dark, and ended exactly as projected, and the Concordance could account for us as a completed observation. A species that climbed too fast and fell off the branch, just as the War Marshal had said. They closed our file with a clear conscience because the corridor was dark, and to the Concordance a dark corridor meant absence. It did not mean absence. It meant the molt had reached the stage where the old shell goes still. It meant we had gone quiet the way the deepest work is always quiet. The Concordance had built an entire epistemology on the principle that to be seen is to be known, and so when we could no longer be seen, they concluded we could no longer be anything, and they signed the page, and they shelved the file, and they were satisfied. They marked our absence on the very day our presence finally finished assembling itself in the one place they had stopped looking. I should tell you what we lost, because I will not have this account be the boast the droll assumed Renner was making. The change cost us. A molt is not free. When a creature sheds the form that kept it alive, there is an interval, longer than you would think, in which it has shed the old defenses and not yet hardened the new ones, and many things do not survive that interval. We did not all cross. Whole colonies that had been built for the shared lane world, dependent on corridors that were now closed, did not make the change in time. There were years of scarcity that the projections had not been wrong to predict. There were losses I will not catalog, because the dead are not material for an argument, and because the people who tell this story as a triumph have generally not had to translate a casualty manifest from a colony tongue into the trade language, so that the rest of us could understand what we had paid. We paid. I want that on the record under my own name. We were not a clever species that fooled a foolish council. We were a young one that was thrown into the dark and changed there, and the change killed a great many of us, and the ones who came out the far side of it were not the people who went in. I was one of the ones who came out, and I am telling you I did not recognize my own kind by the end. I do not mean that as horror. I mean it as the simple truth of a molt. The animal that emerges is not the larva grown larger. It is a different shape entirely, built from the same material, and it does not remember being legible. 41 years after the vote, the Concordance reconvened on the hearth for a session that had nothing to do with us. I know this because I was there for it. I came back through a lane the Concordance did not know was open, in a vessel they could not read, as part of a delegation they had marked closed 4 decades before, and I sat in the visitors' tier of the great bright hall under the same flat dome, and I waited for the moment our return would be entered into the record. We did not announce ourselves. That was a decision, and it was the correct one, and it was also the most human thing we did the whole day. We could have arrived as a fleet. We had by then the means to arrive as anything we wished, and the temptation in some quarters was real, because 41 years is a long time to carry a closed door. But the planners who had become the spine of the new form understood something the droll never could. The droll believed power was display. They believed a strength not shown was a strength not held. We had spent 4 decades unobserved, and we had learned in the dark the exact opposite lesson. We had learned that the most complete kind of power is the kind that does not need to be seen to be true, and that the surest way to prove you have surpassed a body built on display is to refuse to perform for it. So we walked in, a small delegation on foot through the visitors' entrance, carrying nothing that registered as a weapon, because nothing we carried needed to. And we waited for the Concordance to notice that a closed entry had sat down in its hall. It took a clerk. It always takes a clerk. A 4-armed scholar of the register, the species that kept the great book, came down through the tiers to ask the visitors' station for our standing, the way they asked every visitor, and I watched the scholar's hands go still as the codes resolved. I watched the scholar look up from the lectern, across the bright floor, to the small delegation sitting in the tier reserved for the unimportant, and I watched the slow horror of a record keeper realizing that the record is wrong arrive in a face built for nothing but recording. The scholar did the only thing a register scholar can do when confronted with a closed entry that is plainly, physically present. The scholar opened the book to the human page and read it aloud to the chamber, because that is the law. The entry must be read before it can be amended, and so the Concordance heard in the flat voice of its own clerk the words it had filed 41 years before. Provisional, lapsed, terminal, closed. The whole arc of its certainty read out into the silence, with the subjects of the entry sitting in plain sight at the bottom of the room. I had been an interpreter for over half a century by then. I had heard a great many sentences land in a great many rooms. I had never heard a silence like the one that followed the reading of our own obituary in our presence. Savak was still alive. He was very old by then, his crest grown heavy with horn, his bronze hide dulled to the color of a thing long out of the sun, and he held a seat of honor now, a war marshal emeritus, a living monument to the Concordance's great housekeeping. He rose from that seat slowly, and the chamber gave him the old silence out of habit, and he looked down the bright tiers at the delegation in the visitors' tier, and I will tell you that I watched a war marshal of the drawl try to read motion in a thing he had been certain was finished, and find that he could not. The four-chambered eyes that had read the gate of 1,000 enemies passed over us and found nothing they had a category for. We were not aggressive. We were not afraid. We were not pleading, and we were not displaying. We were simply there, completed, in a shape his entire civilization had no field to record. And for the first time in his long life, the war marshal of the drawl looked at a thing and could not name what it was. He did the thing his law required. It was the only move he had. He called for the honor blades. I want you to understand what it cost the chamber to grant that call, and what it meant that they granted it anyway. To post the 10 warriors around a thing is to declare it terminal and contained. It is a ritual for the removal of a danger you have already mastered. By calling for it, Savak was insisting, against the evidence of his own stilled eyes, that we were still the form he had measured, that the closed entry was correct, that whatever had walked into the hall was merely the old larva returned and could be contained as the old larva had been. It was a denial dressed as a ceremony, and the Concordance, which had built itself on the principle that a thing seen is a thing known, granted the call rather than admit that it was looking at something it could not see clearly. They sent the 10 warriors down onto the bright floor one more time. The honor blades who came down were not the ones from 41 years before. Those were dead, most of them, of age and of the lives the drawl led. These were young, the best of a new generation, bronze hide bright and unmarked, ceremonial harness immaculate, and they came down with the perfect confidence of warriors who had been told their whole lives that their caste had once contained the terminal human thing and would do so again. They arranged themselves in the closed ring around our station, 10 of them, facing outward, presenting our containment to the assembly. It was the same ritual, performed in the same hall, under the same flat light, with the same number of blades. The drawl are nothing if not consistent. Consistency is what fixedness means. And here is where I have to be most careful, because what happened next has been made into 100 stories, and not one of them is true, and the truth is colder and quieter than any of them. Nothing happened. The 10 warriors formed the ring, and they faced outward, and they held the ceremonial pose, and the chamber waited, the way it had waited 41 years before, for the small animal in the center to do something that would justify the spectacle. And the man at the center of the ring, the man who led our delegation, an old man now himself, looked up at the nearest warrior and then up the long bright tiers at Savak, and he did not stand, and he did not speak. He simply let them hold the ring. He let them hold it because the ring did not contain anything. The drawl ritual is built on a single assumption, and it is the same assumption the whole Concordance was built on, and the man at the center of the ring had understood for 41 years that the assumption was false. The ritual assumes that to contain the delegate is to contain the thing, It assumes the danger is in the room. It assumes that the creature you can see is the creature you are dealing with, that the form in front of you is the form, full stop, the whole of it, present and accounted for, and now surrounded by 10 of your best. But we were not in the room. The delegation in the ring was not humanity any more than a single cast-off shell is the animal that left it. It was the part of the new form that had come to the chamber to do the one thing that needed doing in person, which was to be seen sitting calmly inside the very ritual that was supposed to prove our removal, so that every species in that hall would understand, without a single weapon being shown, that the ritual no longer meant anything. The 10 warriors had formed a ring around a man, and the man had let them, because letting them was the proof. You cannot contain a thing by surrounding the place it used to be. Savok understood it. I watched him understand it. It is the only moment in this entire account where I felt something close to pity, and I have spent years deciding whether I am ashamed of that, and I have concluded that I am not. He had stood 10 of his best around a human station 41 years before and called it containment, and he had been wrong then in a way he could not have known, and he was wrong now in a way he could no longer avoid knowing, and the knowing arrived in his old face the way a tide arrives, without drama, filling every low place at once. He had spent his whole life believing the worst thing a creature could be was unfinished. He was now looking at the finished form of the most unfinished thing he had ever logged, and it had come back not to fight him, which he would have understood, but to sit quietly inside his ceremony and let him discover that his ceremony was empty. He gave the order to release the ring. There was nothing else to give. The 10 young warriors, who did not understand, who had been told this was a triumph, stepped back from our station in perfect order, and the perfection of it was the most painful part, because they performed the withdrawal exactly as their caste had performed it 41 years before, the same 8 steps, the same closing of the ranks, a flawless execution of a ritual that had just been revealed to everyone in that hall who was paying attention to mean precisely nothing. The register scholar still stood at the lectern with the human page open. The law required the entry to be amended now that the subject had been confirmed present. The scholar asked our delegation through me what classification we wished to be entered under, and that question, that small procedural question asked by a clerk doing a clerk's duty, was the moment the Concordance's whole order came apart, though almost no one in the room understood it yet. Because there was no class for us. The register had 3, provisional for the unfinished, terminal for the ending, ascendant for those who had reached their full and final form and could be admitted as peers. The clerk expected us to claim ascendant. That was the only upward move the system allowed, the only way a provisional entry could resolve. The whole chamber expected it, I think, in the half-second before our delegate answered. They expected us to claim peerage. They were braced for it, even some of them, a provisional clawing up to ascendant after a long absence, an unprecedented thing but a legible one, a thing the register could hold. Our delegate declined to claim any class at all. He said, through me, and again I rendered it with nothing added, that the human entry could not be filed ascendant, because ascendant meant final, and we were not final. He said we did not consider ourselves to have reached a last form, and that a species which had molted once in the dark had no reason to believe it would not molt again, and that he would not enter us into a register whose entire premise was that a form once reached was the end of the matter. He said the Concordance was welcome to keep its book. He said we simply would not be in it. And then he said the only thing in the whole exchange that the old man let himself say with any weight, the human equivalent of Renner's single sentence 41 years before, and I have carried it every day since. He said, "You built a book of final forms and ruled a galaxy with it. We are the proof there is no such thing." That was the reckoning, not a fleet, not a weapon, A clerk standing at a lectern with no field to enter us under, and a chamber slowly understanding that the absence of that field was not a gap in their book, but a hole in the floor they had all been standing on. The register's authority had never come from its accuracy. It had come from its completeness, from the unspoken promise that every real thing had a class, and every class had a meaning, and the book, therefore, contained the galaxy. We had just demonstrated, by the simple act of declining to be entered, that the book did not contain the galaxy. It contained only the things that had agreed to hold still long enough to be written down. The Concordance could not vote on us. That was the thing they discovered in the hours after, as they tried to find a procedure to apply to a delegation that would not claim a class. You cannot exile what you cannot classify, because exile is itself a classification, a moving of an entry from active to annex, and there was no entry to move. You cannot threaten what does not need your corridors, and we had not used a concordance lane to arrive, and would not use one to leave. You cannot even refuse to recognize a thing that has explicitly declined your recognition. The refusal lands on empty air. Every instrument the Concordance had was an instrument for managing entries in a book, and we had simply, quietly, stepped outside the book, and stood there in the bright flat light of their own honest dome, and let them see that the book had edges. We did not stay long. There was no reason to. We had come to be seen sitting inside the ring, and to decline the only classification that could have made us safe to them, and to let the consequences of those two acts do the rest of the work without our help. The delegation rose, and I rose with it, and we walked out of the assembly of the Concordance through the visitors' entrance, the way we had come, on foot, carrying nothing. Behind us the chamber stayed silent, not the indulgent silence they had given Renner 41 years before. A different silence. The silence of a body that has just heard a sentence it spent 4 decades certain it understood, and understood at last that it had never understood it at all. The hours after were procedural, and the procedure was the worst of it for them, because procedure was the one thing the Concordance had always been able to trust. The speaker convened the Standing Committee on Classification. The register scholars were summoned to the lectern and asked to propose an entry. The committee deliberated, and I stayed to translate for our delegation, and I listened to the most powerful body in the recorded galaxy discover, in real working time, that it had no instrument for the situation in front of it. They tried ascendant first, the upward resolution, and the scholars pointed out that we had declined it on the record, and that the register could not enter a class against a subject's stated refusal, because the whole legitimacy of the book rested on entries being acknowledged. They tried to reopen the closed entry and amend it, and a junior scholar, to her credit, observed that reopening a closed entry to file it unclassifiable would require the chamber to admit the closed entry had been an error, and that an admitted error in the register was a precedent no ascendant species would survive, because every entry in the book was now potentially an error too. They tried, finally, to do nothing, to simply let the session end with the matter unresolved, and that was when the oldest of the register scholars, the keeper of the book, said the words that ended the deliberation. He said that an unresolved entry was itself a class. He said that for the first time in the Concordance's history, there was a thing in the galaxy that the register acknowledged to exist and could not contain, and that every species in the hall had now seen it, and that the book could no longer claim to be complete, and that a book of forms which is known to be incomplete is no longer a law. He closed the great book on the human page and did not reopen it. I translated all of it for our delegation, and our delegate listened with his hands flat on the visitor's rail, and when the keeper closed the book the delegate nodded once, the way a man nods when a long-running account has finally been settled in his favor, and there is no satisfaction in it, only the closing of the ledger. I passed close to Savok's tier on the way out. I had translated for him more times than I could count in the years before the vote. An old habit turned my head toward him as I passed, the way you look toward a man whose voice you once spent your days carrying. He was not looking at the delegation. He was looking at his own hands, the way the very old look at the tools they can no longer trust, and he did not see me, and I did not stop. There was nothing to say that the day had not already said. He had filed the larva. He had shelved the animal. He had stood 10 of his best around an empty shell and called it the world. I have spent the rest of my life among the form we became, and I will be honest with you, as I have tried to be honest throughout, that I do not always like it. The shape that came out of the dark is not warm. It does not explain itself. It does not perform for an audience, and it does not seek to be loved, and a part of me, the part that came up in the shared lane years when we still wanted the Concordance to think well of us, sometimes mourns the loud, legible, unfinished thing we used to be. That thing was easier to live inside. It was younger. It still believed that to be seen was to be known, that if it only explained itself clearly enough the council would understand, and the entry would resolve, and we would be admitted at last as peers. The council never understood. It was never going to. It had built itself to be incapable of understanding us, because understanding us would have required admitting that its whole order rested on a thing that was not true, and no body that large surrenders its foundation to a small delegation at the bottom of a room. So they did the only thing their order allowed. They measured us, found us unfinished, and filed us away in the dark, and the dark finished us, and now there is no field in their book for what they made. The Concordance still meets on the hearth. The dome still pours its flat, honest light down on the tiers, and the register scholars still keep their book, and the drawls still post their 10 honor blades around the things they intend to remove. But the book has a hole in it now, an open entry that cannot be classed and will not be closed, and every species in that hall knows it is there, and knows what it means and governs itself accordingly. The Concordance rules a smaller galaxy than it thinks it does. It rules the part that agreed to be written down. The rest of it, the part that learned in the dark that a form is only ever a stage, conducts its business outside the edges of the book, and does not ask the council's leave, and does not perform. I translated the vote that sent us away in a single afternoon. I have spent the years since trying to translate what came back, and their language still has no word for it, and I have come to believe, after all this time, that the absence of the word is the truest thing the register ever recorded about us.